Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
Hello.
Let's see here. Or good afternoon, I should say.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Nice to have you guys. I'm going to check you off one by one to make sure that you get your credit for this. All right. Let's see here. All right. I'm just missing one. Okay. All right. So before I begin sharing about these argumentative pieces that I've put together, are there any questions or comments? How are you guys doing out there as far as expectations that you think I have with what you're writing, timing, notification of anything? Is there anything I need to be aware of or improve?
I have a question about the last assignment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Um, I didn't know how many pages we were supposed to write, so I only did one.
Yeah, I apologize for that. Honestly, I've said this before to other students is that I don't ever ask for um, a minimum in length. However, most of the time, if it is a half page or less, most of the time it's missing key elements in my estimation.
Okay.
So a page sounds wonderful.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, I was just wondering.
No, thank you though, Max, because I'm sure that question helped other people too.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
No problem. Nice to talk with you.
You too.
Hey, anybody else? Anybody else? Any other concerns or comments? Because by all means, right, that it's we have a disconnect, not being able to meet one another in class, which of course, if I had my way, I would have it that way. But I understand. You're probably taking online classes for good reason. You're probably very busy with work and family, etc. So it just kind of has to be done. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and share the page. All right. I don't know if you guys noticed the file that I attached, but I attached a file, right? Um, on the Spanish colonizer. It's kind of a new one. All right. It's single section and it's pretty long. And I apologize for that, but it's like 8 pages long. So here are the notes that I wrote for an in-person class when we covered that. And remember, the reason why I'm going over it is remember, I tried to make it clear it's only a file, it's not an assignment, because I will have at least one, if not more, questions on test one pertinent to it. Okay. So, historians like Howard Zinn and others, right? They they know what they're doing. They're sensationalizing things. They're simplifying things because not to be too negative or too critical of them because they're sure as heck smarter than I. Howard Zinn taught at Harvard, um, but they somewhat a bit have an agenda, and Howard Zinn admits to such actually. in his famous U.S. history book on page 10 right away. But at any rate, what they'll do, what he does is he is somewhat Marxist, and he's quite far to the left, and he thinks that capitalism is inherently parasitical and unethical. For someone to win, someone else is going to lose, have to lose, and that it's Darwinian, right? And so. With that, they also do conflict history at Harvard with the demographics that have lost. They want to elicit your indignation, your righteous anger, your compassion. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but I just want you to be aware of, whatever wherever someone is coming from, okay, and see their bias. So at any rate, I'm kind of arguing against that. So I said here the common narrative of the correlation, the fact that Spain and England were coming out of a medieval time period, and coming from that medieval time period, they supposedly had a very provincial, backward mentality. And let's face it, right? When you read books like there's a book called Reorient, one word, um, Reorient by Andre Gunnar Frank, and it's very much focuses on economics, and it shows commerce, trade, and the kind of epicenter of all of it being in East Asia, particularly off of China and the coast of the Bengal coast of India. And so, at any rate, he depicts in his book the Europeans as these adolescent upstarts, right? That they had been highly decentralized with the feudal setup of Europe. But even with the feudalism, with the decentralization, they had been living under tyranny and a very much a lack of knowledge of the outside world. Hence the negative uh, adjective provincial, right? You're provincial. You're just a product of your small little town and your outlook. It's very much in academia a negative connotation. Okay, so supposedly them being these backward medieval-like Europeans who are only familiar with their own world, right? And because their royal and parliamentary bodies began to open up the economy to make it more capitalistic, more of a free open market, that because of those things, that it should have been easy to tell, and it could darn well be depicted as inevitable that they were going to come and make a mess of the Americas. Okay. So I put the instructor begged to differ, contending that the truth and causation were much more complicated than that. All right. So I do the granted but approach. I say, okay, granted, let's take a look at, the common narrative as to, Howard Zinn and these other writers. So first of all, right, the fact that the Europeans, it seems like the Genoese and those from Florence seem to chronologically have been the first merchants to make it into the quote Orient and found that wonderful impressive world of trade. And then shortly thereafter, you have some from Flanders, which is Belgium, Portugal, of course, and then eventually Spain and the Netherlands. And so, at any rate, when they come into Indonesia in particular, there is a bit of, especially in Indonesia, there's a bit of lack. I mean, the type of capitalism, if you could call it that, was pretty barbaric. So, for instance, right, there's a guy named David Boyle, and he has a book on Columbus, and he writes about this Darwinian world that the Europeans entered, uh, known as the rat race in the Orient. Okay, and remember, Orient just means East in Latin or Asia. So at any rate, it says that they come into this place and they realize that might makes right. in this area. So Columbus, for instance, right? He would sit by, and there was a Cicerone gentleman with that last name, and who was a big money lender in Genoa. And he asked Columbus, he said, why do I want to invest my money into you? How are you going to make it grow? What are you going to do for me? And Columbus learned the very simple tactic of telling him, I'll do anything you want. So he was told to go to Luanda and pick up African slaves. So he did so. He was sent to Chios, where he engaged in piracy and was almost killed. He had compatriots that fought in the Moluccas. The Moluccas were known as the Spice Islands in Indonesia, and some of them lost their lives. And then it's just crazy when you look at the fact that first Portugal, then the Netherlands, and it really that's a misnomer saying Portugal and Netherlands. Portuguese pirates, basically licensed pirates, right? Profiteers and Dutch profiteers then took the Spice Islands, and the Portuguese took it back, and then it was taken by some other. European power besides those two. But it got crazy. Okay. And so it kind of it whet the appetite of the very most this is the argument, right? It whet the appetite of the most dangerously ambitious and perhaps greedy people within Europe to come join this. Okay, so then the word spread through the Gutenberg press, through cartographical schools. Cartography is just map making. Okay, and so let's take a look at Spain in particular. There you can make the argument, and so does J.H. Eliot. J.H. Eliot, I would highly recommend if you wanted to read further into Spanish colonization. Very well respected historian. But according to H.J. Eliot, Ferdinand and Isabella, in each of their respective provinces in Spain, were precariously holding on to their thrones. Okay. There was a niece known as La Beltraneja, and she was an infant, and she was to be, as the daughter of Carlos V, she was to be the next queen, and Isabella usurped her throne. Ferdinand fought with half brothers over his father's throne, and they had like a mini civil war in Aragon. And so the argument is, right, is that this came to be a pragmatic, tempting um, opportunity for these two, this king and queen, trying to unite Spain. So you have it here. Whoever risked life and funds to conquer in the Americas was now free to. They would receive minor noble status, known as Hidalgo, was the title, lands, political titles, and the forced labor of the Native Americans that they had, quote, conquered, known as the encomienda system. Okay. And there seemed to have been a pattern is Spain had the primogenitor in Intel, the names of such in England, right? They had the same thing in Spain. It was known as the mayorazgo. For my Spanish speakers, el hijo mayor, the oldest son, got everything from dad and nothing for the other siblings. So what do you know, right? A lot of conquistadores who took this blank check to come conquer, right? They had seen their father, by example, in the Reconquista and fighting the Moors and knocking them out of Cordoba in southern Spain, be rewarded for such, give them a taste of a better life, and then as their elder brother was getting to continue that, they thought, I'm going to follow my father, and I'm going to carve out my own little kingdom in the Americas. And so oftentimes, according to J.H. Eliot, a lot of letters coming back at home were with the desperate hope or with the boast of having done so already of pasando mejor, right? Pasar mejor. They want to become better off. They want to improve their socioeconomic position. Okay. And so, at any rate, Pope Alexander the Sixth adds to this with the famous Alexandrine papal bulls. Okay. And the most famous was Tordesillas, Tordesillas, just the name of the city where it was made. But at any rate, Alexander the Sixth gave his blessing to the Spanish as well as to the Portuguese on the eastern end of the Americas to dispossess the Native Americans with one caveat: they were to save their souls. They were to convert them to Catholic Christianity. All right. The problem is, though, right, is known as the Patronato, is the Pope gave complete leverage to, at this time, it was either Ferdinand or his father, Carlos the First, gave him his blessing and said, "You get to decide the methods of church organization and proselytization, right? Proselytizing the natives, making Christians out of them." And so sometimes they themselves, as the crown, didn't really do their job or were unable to 3,000 miles away across an Atlantic Ocean. And so you had some ruthless methods that were brought about by some Spanish conquistadores who probably were not your average goody two-shoe Catholics. All right. So one instance of such terrible methods is el requerimiento you see here. They would read the Nicene Creed from the church, right? Their major beliefs about the Trinity and about the gospel. And then they would tell the native tribe, you have 24 hours to convert, or we declare holy war against you. So they're not messing around. All right. And then when you look at England, they also were opening up their economy, and it also did seem to have um, the effect of encouraging colonization, or the bad word, right, is imperialism, bullying others, and also the well-to-do gobbling up everybody else, the smaller ones. So you had joint stock companies. However much money you invested in the company, that was the percentage that you got from profits. But why, if you're wealthy and you could already make great money from its profits, why take a 2 out of 5 chance of dying going across the Atlantic and getting your hands dirty when you could stay in Sussex or Wessex, England, where you have all these wealthy gentrymen owning lots of land, and just live your comfortable lifestyle and let someone else do the dangerous work? And those people were known as adventurers. So the adventurers would go on behalf of their investors, and they were treated and rewarded for such, and treated as if they had put in a certain percentage of funds, when in reality they hadn't. But in lieu of that, they risked their lives. All right. I can't begin to guess what percentage it is, to be honest, you guys. But with some of the joint stock companies being, run by only about a dozen men, but including at least 4 dozen investors, um, it's just a guess. I'd like to think that they probably at Adventure could get credit for anything for just a couple percent up to perhaps easily 10% credit. So then you also had the indentured servitude, right? And I know I should have that here somewhere in my notes. Let's see here. I should have, at any rate. Yeah, there we go. Indentured servants, right here. Sorry. So, so at any rate, you could subject yourself for 3 to 7 years as a temporary slave, a temporary serf. And when your 7 years were up, you're supposed to have learned and been taught a trade. You were supposed to have been given a freehold, which is enough acreage of land to live off of comfortably. And you were to be given victuals. Victuals are like foodstuffs, while you're cultivating your land and building your cabin, etc. So at any rate, they were known collectively as freedom dues, as well as denizenship. And denizenship is a fancy word that means qualified citizenship. All right. So with some of these indentured servants, some of them were taken against their will. They took some people that were involved in crime, some children who were orphaned and homeless. And so some of the most very desperate people came as indentured servants. And it kind of is symbolized. I know this is a simplification in my head, but I still do it. Is I've come across two completely different primary sources on this practice. One is from a guy named George Alsop, Alsop. And according to George Alsop, he says, "Hey, look at me, man. I started off as a lowly indentured servant, and now I am a well-to-do planter, agricultural farmer with lots of laborers, and I'm living the life." So he became like the poster child for come and be an indentured servant, and when it's done, all will be well. And then there is another man named Richard Frethorn, Frethorne. And Richard Frethorn's letter is pitiful. He's saying basically, Mom, Dad, if you've ever loved me, buy my indenture out and let me come home as soon as possible. Said they corporally, bodily punish us. They withhold food from us and medicine. They won't arm us when we're attacked by Native Americans out in the fields. And many of us are not getting our promised freedom dues when all is said and done. All right. So then what do you know? The gentry class of well-to-do aristocrats back in England, and remember Aristoi means the best in Greek, so they claim to have the best bloodline and entitled to be able to sit alone in the House of Lords and on the King's Privy Council. And they alone were the first to get patronage or royal backing for buying lots of good land in England, which of course was scarce as an island nation. So what do you know? The second, third, and fourth sons of gentrymen began buying up most of the good land in Virginia because the eldest son, through primogeniture, right, was getting dad's stuff. And then the intel part was that you can't break the property up and sell it to separate people. It is just a blatant way of trying to maintain your aristocratic privileged position, right? Down generations. So at any rate, and then I put here, Spain's history was very, very diverse. So I don't know if you guys have had a chance to read it, but it's crazy, the diversity that Spain has experienced nationally, ethnically, religiously, culturally, um, throughout its recorded history. All right. I'm trying to think if I should get into that right now or just start the Black Legend and see where it falls. That I would imagine it'll come up with that. And so if you don't mind, I think I will do that. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to open up the Black Legend. All right. Let's see here. So are you guys doing okay? You guys still with me? Haven't died of boredom yet, right?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. All right. So let's see here. Um, I'm going to because I don't want to keep you forever. And plus, I want you to derive be able to derive the data in the thesis, because I know you can. But at the same time, I don't want to shortchange you. So I'm trying to find a healthy balance in how long and how much I talk about each of these numbers. All right. Let's see here. Up to 2 and 1. Number one, okay, is a big one. It's a book called A Brief History of the Dis or you see here in the footnotes, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. And the Indies, right, they meant the Caribbean and the Americas. And this began, you guys, arguably the Black Legend. And ironically, right, it's written by a Spaniard himself. So, why something bad has to be black is to be held for another day's topic. But when they contended that the Spanish were religiously um, fanatical, intolerant, um, very hierarchical or undemocratic, okay, very greedy and violent, and very kind of backward by Whig standards. WHIG, Whig standards are just basically the individual having as many rights and opportunities as possible, and government being just the opposite of tyrannical. All right. So by Whig standards, they claim that the Spanish were almost like a perfect anti-model, like everything by Whig standards that you do not want. Okay, as a lesson to be learned. And so there was a Spanish jurist, and jurists were interpreters of the law and lawyers for the king. There was a Spanish jurist who said, "This is all just a black legend about us. It's a lie. It's a dark lie." So that's where they get that term. So most of the time, if you study Spanish colonization of the Americas in the early modern era, like the 1500s and up, you'll find that term, the Black Legend, quite often interspersed into historical books. Okay. So at any rate, I mean, he's got the gut. He's got the bad stuff. All right. Massacres. All right. One infamous one was the Cholulan massacre, like that. The hot sauce Cholula. Um, Cholula was a suburb of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, in the Aztec days, and they invited the Spanish conquistadors, into their stadium, and they did a dance, a ceremonial one. And when they're in the midst of their dance, the Spaniards cut off all the exits and massacred the dancers and those that were there to watch, the spectators as well, that were indigenous, that were native. It's known as the Cholulan Massacre. Um, you have New Mexico. To be honest, if someone asked me as a student, uh, saying, "Hey, Mr. Kyle, Derek, I want you to adhere to the Black Legend. All right, I want you to just give it to the Spanish, how awful they were and what a great anti-model they are today. But you have to use all your data from present day U.S. territory. I would probably for sure choose New Mexico. All right. So, for instance, if you're interested in the topic, there's a book called When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away, okay, by a guy named Gutierrez. And it is just the epitome of conflict history. The Spaniards come in and they psychologically try to subdue and subjugate the Navajo and other Pueblo people of New Mexico. They're extremely harsh with them and demanding that they assimilate to being good Catholics. If there was a rebellion of any sort, they felt because they were so outnumbered by the Native Americans that they had to make a statement and frighten the Native American community from ever trying to revolt again. So, right, they call that a deterrence, right? Like telling your neighbors, don't mess with my house, the owner has a gun, right? Or whatever. You're literally trying to scare your opposition from attacking you. So, yeah, and then you had a full out indigenous rebellion in 1680 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that supposedly either chased out or killed every Spaniard in that city on the single day of September of 1680. All right. They also, for a while, began enslaving and trading Native Americans. And Las Casas, the same guy who wrote this book, convinced King Carlos I to stop doing that, and instead, however, sadly, to employ African slaves. All right, and so the Spanish participated in the slave trade as well. Okay, they had a system in the Caribbean known as the repartimiento. I don't know if you'll need to know that word, but just in case here, I'm going to write it. So remember, privately, okay, it was called the encomienda when natives had to forcefully work. And remember, they're not remunerated. They're not paid any salary. It's their tribute. It's what they owe their subjugating colonizer boss. Okay. So privately, for a conquistador, this forced labor was known as encomienda. And then publicly for the government of Spain, it was called repartimiento. And it was very similar, is when they wanted public works of some sort to be done, or if there was a rebellion and they needed to conscript at quick notice um, soldiers, they would go to the leaders of the Native Americans and make demands, right? That they present, a certain number, certain hundred or higher than that number of indigenous people to come do their public job. Okay. So at any rate, yeah, you have data to support the Black legend beyond a shadow of a doubt. Um, the instances of Spain being very hierarchical, we're going to get to soon. All right. Notice in the new laws of 1542, under the same Carlos. He's Carlos the First in Spain, but he's Charles the Fifth over the Holy Roman Empire. It's the same dude. Okay, so whichever one you want to call him, this Charles the Fifth, he formally put an end in the new laws to the encomienda system. But the hacendados, the leaders of the plantations and the big agricultural farms and ranches, rose up in such rebellion that he dare not try again to enforce it. All right. So at any rate, yeah. So there you have it, right? This is the beginning of the Black Legend, and he hits on most of those negative adjectives that I mentioned. Las Casas does. All right. Well, number two is during the civil rights era, as we've gone over, not only did people want to begin to show through conflict history the way by which certain demographics, especially quote minorities, have suffered injustices of many sorts, that they want to elicit your anger, right, your indignation and your pity and compassion. They didn't want the narrative to stop there because it felt like it was kind of condescending. Like, oh, these poor little Native American children, these poor African Americans, they were just victimized in one way after another. And so the term is used, right, simultaneously by that generation is, wait a minute, yes, they were wrong, but they still had human moral agency, right? They still lived like adults. They made decisions that mattered. They had free will. They weren't just passive recipients of historical developments. Okay. So that includes you guys rising up and rebelling and doing things that might be considered quite brutal. Native American historians, nevertheless, would prefer that knowledge of those dirty details as to the condescending narrative of them just being childlike and having been victimized. Because remember Las Casas, the same guy that I mentioned, the Spanish priest who wrote how awful his Spanish people had been. Remember, he called them meek sheep. That was the famous quote that he called Native Americans, ovejas mansas. And so now, though, right? And number two, they're not acting like ovejas mansas. They're tricking, they're extorting, they're surprising and ambushing Euro-American intruders. Okay. A good case of that, you guys, if I were to go along these lines, as far as, Native Americans making their demands and affecting history themselves, and I had to use U.S. territory, I would feel split between Florida and California. Okay. In both places, they began making concessions, the Spanish, that is, and allowing certain rights and opportunities to their quote neophytes, their Native Americans that were put into the missions, that they never intended to give to them. But they were such was the feeling of fear that the Spanish had and desperation that they knew they better count their blessings and give the indigenous people what they wanted. All right. So again, Native American spokesman, like a guy named Vine Deloria, who's well known speaking on behalf of Native Americans in history books, he's proud of this. Okay. Oh, and by the way, as far as being capable of being deceptive and being ruthless, etc. Another account, if you were ever interested in looking into the conquistadors' conquest of Mexico against the mighty Aztec kingdom, there's a guy named Castillo, right? The word for castle, um, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, and he was an ex conquistador and he wrote what he called the true history of what happened, right? La Historia Verdadera was the title of his book, because he's implying, right, that Las Casas wasn't even there. He didn't really know what happened. And in fairness to Castillo, right, Las Casas was very terrible as an historian to take things out of context, right? He'll mention a massacre. Then he jumps to another region several years ahead and jumps right into the next famous massacre. And he doesn't give you context as to, well, what was going on, what led to that, etc., right? Because by his own concession, Las Casas was trying to elicit anger and a sense of a desire to protect Native Americans amongst those who read his book. Okay. So anyway, you guys will get that easily. Columbus's World. This is one of them, you guys, where I had a tongue in cheek as I wrote this. I'm like, I don't buy this at all, but it's thought provoking and it does give some context. And so I'll go ahead and try to summarize this book that I just read. So David Boyle, it's called Toward the Setting Sun, and he wants you to feel a sense of empathy with the moral dilemma that Columbus experienced more than once, being an armed merchant. Okay. He talks about how Columbus's dad was such a hard worker, but he just could not free himself from poverty. He talked about how the guilds were so cliquey that there were a couple different types of skills that young Columbus had, but the guilds would not accept him to apprentice him under them to do such for a living. He talks about his passion for discovery and his love for cartography or maps. Okay. And then he contends, right, that he did not fund his own money. He was too poor. He was desperate for an investor or investors, plural, to grant him money. And as I mentioned earlier, those investors usually had specific demands that they placed upon people like Columbus that took their funds. So I think you know where I'm going with this, right? He's contending, right, that Columbus is just a pawn in a much bigger, more ruthless economic system, and that he was doing what he felt he had to do to liberate his family and himself from poverty. So I thought it was interesting to know that context, but don't think for a second that I'm 100% with that thesis. And I think, like I have here right at the very end, did I let Columbus off the hook too easily? I think so. Absolutely. All right. Then number four, the term that they use for this one, okay, is historicism. with historicism, right? It's a very simple premise is people are the whole nature versus nurture argument. People are primarily much more formed in their beliefs and behavior, their outlook by their environment than they are by their DNA, that we're products of our environment. Okay. So again, this is playing the devil's advocate. I practically had a smile on my face when I wrote this one as well. All right. Kind of letting the Spanish off the hook. But I contend, right, that the Spaniards almost did not know any better. Okay. Um, the cultural role of the Catholic Church was secured in the 400s and 500s by a people called the Goths. In particular, they were called the Western Goths. The Visigoths were the ones that took over Spain when Rome fell. And they gave all kinds of power to the Bishop of Toledo. And that's where they get that old. You guys are too young to know that expression, but people used to say Holy Toledo. Um, but at any rate, the Archbishop of Toledo had always had a lot of power. Okay. You culturally were expected to go to mass regularly, okay, through much of Spain's history. And then there's a great enhancement of consciousness about religion when the Moors took over Spain, right, in 711 under a guy named Tariq, Ibn al-Tariq. And they form a Muslim kingdom that they called Al-Andalus, that we get the term Andalusia from. But at any rate, religion was about so much during that time. If you would not convert to Islam, you had to pay a special tax and you had to pay tribute in public works. Through many of the caliphs that were in Cordoba, Spain, they would not allow Spanish Catholics to rise up in their bureaucracy. Now, were there exceptions? Of course. There was a guy named Ibn al-Ramad III, and he had like a renaissance in Cordoba, Spain. And he one of the most talented, regardless of who they were or what their background was or demographic was. But you could make the argument that he was an exception. Okay. Then in 1513, the Protestant Reformation starts, and the Catholic Church endorses fighting and forcing these Protestants back into the Catholic fold. Okay. Of course, let us not forget about the infamous Spanish Inquisition that got so much attention when they imposed it in the Netherlands against the Dutch. All right. So again, killing in the name of God. So then I say, they didn't have the scientific revolution yet. That's waiting for the next century. And you can make the argument that a big part of the scientific revolution, right, is your way to knowledge. The fancy word for it is epistemology. Okay. Um, your epistemology is how you come to know what you know. Okay. So the worst type of epistemology, according to science, is dogmatism. Remember, when you're dogmatic, you're like, this is what I believe. This is what I believe. Don't show me any evidence to the contrary. I don't want to see any evidence to the contrary. I'm stubbornly adhering to what I've been told to believe in, etc. Right? In academia, dogmatism is terrible. Well, they didn't have that yet. The scientific revolution. Then with the Enlightenment in the 1740s, the idea that every human being is just that, a human being that's endowed by the Creator with certain rights that cannot be alienated from him or her. Right? Hence our founding fathers, the Declaration. We didn't have that yet. Okay. Then another big one, you guys, that I was fascinated studying. It wasn't that long ago that I read about this movement, but classical liberalism. The most famous is a guy named John Stuart Mill, an English writer. But basically saying, right, you should have the freedom, the complete autonomy, independence, freedom to swing your fist, okay? And that freedom to swing your fist only ends where my nose begins, right? So if your neighbor wants to adhere to another religion, that's his business and not yours. As long as he doesn't infringe on your rights, he has a right to do his own thing, whatever culture he wants to adhere to, music he wants to listen to, way he wants to dress, the way he wants his marriage organized, etc. It's his business, not yours. That's not, you guys, until the 1820s. So, you know what I mean? The Spanish had not been confronted with any of this. So again, I'm saying that this is kind of all they knew. It was the norm. Then I think it's also big to remember that especially amongst the clergy, right? Because so often they employed missionaries, right? Of the different Catholic orders to come and make Christians of the Native Americans. I think numerically, the top two were Jesuits and Franciscans. Okay, from those two orders. And I think you could definitely make the argument or the generalization that historically the Jesuits were much more open to accommodation to their Native American neophytes in their missions. They accommodated quite a bit. Matter of fact, so much so that they got in trouble back in Rome for watering down their Catholicism. But not so with the Franciscans. The Franciscans, especially in New Mexico, as I mentioned, they were hardcore. All right. So imagine that, like going back to New Mexico. I mean, we're adults here, right? So I can mention this, but it's a little bit embarrassing or whatever. But in that book, when Jesus came, the Corn Mothers went away, the Navajo women offered their bodies to the priests. And because they had a belief spiritually, right? That if they had intimacy with a holy person, that they could become infused with the power of that person's aura through sexual encounter. The priests, right, were just aghast that they would think such. And then, of course, I think you know the extreme example that I'm about to mention is human sacrifice, right? Where there was human sacrifice, the Spanish clergymen, no matter how understanding and compassionate, no matter how not self-serving, I'm sorry, how selflessly and sacrificially some of them allegedly lived for their native neophytes, none of them that I know of were okay with human sacrifice. And so it's the idea, right? Is that this isn't just a matter of you do your thing, you follow your truth, and I follow mine. These clergymen of the Spanish Catholic Church, they were taught a very cut and dry worldview, right? That if you die without Christ and you don't follow some of the sacraments of the Catholic Church, that you're going to go to hell when you die. So that hence they're saving them from that. So anyway, right. And then number five, this one's not that argumentative. This is more informative, to be honest. And that's my weakness, putting it together. But all I try to do is defend the Black Legend now, after I defended the Spaniards a couple times in a row, is going back to criticizing the Spaniards and showing how undemocratic their society was. So their bureaucracy, namely, they had a vice king known as a viceroy or virrey. He was there to enforce all the laws on behalf of the king or queen. You had governors who were handpicked by the viceroy rather than being elected. Then the governors hired and handpicked, they were called corregidores. Okay, we'll write that out. So kind of like the word to correct in Spanish, right? Corregir. These corregidores would go to the city councils in the local villages and towns, and they could overturn any of their decisions. They collected taxes from them by force if need be. And remember, they made the demands of the repartimiento if they demanded that some of the natives do public works to help build a new cathedral or bridge or road or something of that sort. Right. Then finally, at the bottom, you had members of city councils that ran for office, and you had a mayor who was known as an alcalde mayor, where we get the term in English, mayor. But still, these corregidores could come and take away anything that they had done and reverse it. So not only was it that way, the political realm, but also the economic realm as well. They had, for instance, right, the House of Trade. The House of Trade decided who got to engage in the biggest, most money-making, profit-oriented jobs. So sugar and cocoa, coffee and tobacco, cotton, all right, were kind of the main ones. Oh, and then let's not forget, sadly, human slaves, African slaves. You had to have the right connections and carry the right papers to engage in those types of jobs. All right. But the idea is if you're at a local market and you were providing virtually anything and your reach did not stretch beyond your own little province, they often use the term that you could have the dogs can have the crumbs off the table. But anything that really made good money and was on a vast scale was only for the well-connected. So then speaking of the well-connected, right? They literally, according to J.H. Eliot, had a time in which they wanted their highest ranking officials and those who had the best economic opportunities, namely land acquisition, to have, quote, cleanness of blood, limpieza de sangre. And what are they saying? They want a light-skinned Spaniard to control everything. Not a Native American, not an indigena, as they called them, indigenous person, and not even the children who became the majority, by the way, in many Latin American countries. Not the children who grew up known as mestizos, Mestizos. Mestizo literally means like mixed. Had usually a Spanish dad and a Native American mom. Now, of course, you had a few exceptions. One, I kid you not, you could earn a certificate through a good work to be treated on paper as if you were a light-skinned Spaniard. It was known as a gracias al sacarno. So let's say you help a wealthy guy's save a wealthy guy's daughter from drowning in a local river. You fight really well in battle. Okay, you could earn that certificate. And with slaves, to give them credit where credit's due, is the Spanish did not put a bunch of impediments against slaves becoming free. They kind of, says the argument of several well-known historians, let the market do its own thing. And what happened, fortunately for slaves in Latin America, is many of them were placed in or near a city. And there's only so much to do with a limited property in a city that you could have your slave do from day to day. So with more time on his hands and more resources around him in a city, you oftentimes taught your slave a trade and rented your slave out. And your slave could keep a small portion of the money that was paid to him or her for doing that trade. And then once he or she earned enough money that was equivalent to his or her worth in the market, he or she could buy his or her own freedom, known as manumission in English. All right. And then also credit to the Spanish is once they were free, there was a law in 1511, 1513, somewhere right around there. But el ley de mestizaje, the law of miscegenation, whereby the Spanish government um, gave the consent, the okay, that different people of different ethnicities can have children and be formally married in the church. And that sure as heck didn't happen in English America. All right. And the visitor general would come and put Spanish officials under house arrest and give off opportunities to any of those around them to bring forth any accusations against them for misuse of power. And number six, you guys, I just my thesis is very watered down. It's all the above. See, at first, right? A lot of the first writings on the missions were known as hagiographies. Remember, hagia means holy. So these hagiographies are biographies trying to convince you of how holy the missionaries were. So clearly, they're very biased in that direction. And then, as I mentioned, at the time of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, historians did a 180 and they made villains of the missionaries, namely, right, that they made their neophyte natives within the village, within the missions, kill their own culture. That they're also physically violent, exploitative. There's evidence for some of that, for sure. All right. So then you also have evidence of the agency of the natives. The natives, you guys, engaged in strikes on the missions and on the plantations. They made demands, right, for wages. They made demands that at least once per year for a season, they could leave the missions and go back to their families. I mean, you think, okay, what's the big deal with that? The Spanish priests and friars or monks, right, in the missions, thought they would never come back. And worse than that, that they would revert back to their quote pagan religions, and they would have invested their time to save their soul for nothing, in vain. But nevertheless, they worked that out. Then there was accidental damage, especially with the ecosystem and sickness. And a case in point of that I've read of are the Caddo, C-A-D-O, the Caddo tribe in Texas. They developed a reputation for wanting to join the missions, but they died in droves. I can't remember which one it was, you guys, but it's one of the big ones, right? Smallpox, typhoid fever, cholera. Right. So I just say there's a little bit of truth to all those interpretations in California missions. And then lastly, right, I brag about how the whatever you want to think of the Spaniards, however one-sided their civilization was, right, with them on top, they absolutely, in many ways, chose, however begrudgingly, chose to mix their culture with that of Native Americans here. All right. So the first example that always comes to my mind is religion. You'll find in here evidence of them making as many connections with Aztec beliefs as possible. The missionaries, that is, to try to convince the Aztec, right, that they're not disregarding their gods, but they were just a little bit off about their gods. And their gods, these are the real names and the real manifestations of those gods, as the Catholic Church will teach them. The Day of the Dead, right? The Catholic clergy decided they could use ideas about a particular book in the Bible known as the Apocrypha called Second Maccabees, where it suggests that there might be a third place beyond heaven and hell, a purgatory. They use that and other loopholes to put together and cooperate with the Aztec on visitation of the dead, right? For at least 2 consecutive days, the 31st of October and the 1st of November. Then with literature, it was known as the oh, what was the name of the movement? Um, Baroque, the Baroque movement. Okay, I'll write that out. This was big, you guys, in the 1500s back in Spain and Europe. Okay. Well, guess what? They not only created universities here in Latin America and had their students and others read these Baroque works, they not only um, used a printing press and allowed people to purchase this Baroque literature, but they also began to accept some Spanish American that were living here and not in Spain, some of their works and their writings. So the two that really stand out to me the most are a woman named Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and a gentleman called the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega. They were read very popularly back in Spain because Sor Juana was Mexican and Garcilaso el Inca was Peruvian. Right. And then with uh, folk tales and legends and other types of popular culture, right? That absolutely, most of the time, those are examples of mixing, of mestizaje. So, the legend of duendes, La Llorona, El baile de los viejitos. Those all were partly Spanish, partly indigenous. All right. Trying to think if there's anything else. So, well, as I have it there, anybody have any comments or questions? right.
No.
Are you guys okay for us calling it a day?
Chill. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yari. Thank you, Aaliyah. Um, oh, one more thing. I'm gonna put it as an announcement, okay? Um, I'm assuming and hoping that this will be the only time I do this because I know it's very important with your busy schedules to have some consistency. Um, but next week, just this next one, I'm going to send an announcement that I'm going to do our 4:30 Zoom on Tuesday instead of Thursday. I have something going on out of town that I hope you guys don't mind. And so just next week, um, I'm gonna I'm gonna do it on Tuesday instead of Thursday.
Yeah, it's chill. It's cool.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I really appreciate that. And I'll tell you what I'll try to do is I'll try to at least correct your first assignment as soon as I can, so that just make you feel better. Like, okay, I thought I wasn't sure. I thought I knew what I was doing as far as what this instructor wants, but now I know. All right, so I'll try to get on that soon. Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome. You guys are great. I really enjoy this class. You guys are good listeners and you actually give feedback and I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to give you your 5 to 10 extra credit points on your assignments regarding this. All right. So you guys have a great day and God willing, I'll hopefully see you Tuesday, next Tuesday at 4:30.
Thank you. You have a great day too.
You too. Thank you, hon.
You too. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
You too. Bye, you guys.
Bye.
Bye.